Today, I stand before you to talk about a leader whose words and actions are echoing across Africa and beyond. A man who has become a symbol of resistance, sovereignty, and truth. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. In an era where Africa faces challenges of neo-colonialism, economic exploitation, and external interference, Traoré's Unshaken stand has sparked conversations about independence, dignity, and the future of our continent. His bold message is not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation, a call to rise, reclaim our resources, and redefine our destiny. Today we will break down his speech, the truths that Africa must hear, the vision he has for our continent, and why his words matter now more than ever. African sovereignty and resource control are deeply intertwined concepts that lie at the core of the struggle for true independence on the continent. For decades, African nations have celebrated political freedom, marked by the lowering of colonial flags and the rise of new national banners. Yet beneath these symbolic victories, a harsh reality persists. Economic and resource sovereignty remains elusive for most African states. The wealth beneath Africa's soil, in its forests, rivers, and minerals, continues to be controlled, extracted, and profited upon primarily by foreign powers and multinational corporations. This dynamic is not a coincidence, but a deliberate system rooted in the structures of neo-colonialism that perpetuate dependency and underdevelopment. When Ibrahim Traoré speaks about sovereignty, he does not limit it to the notion of national borders or the ability to elect leaders. His focus is on the tangible economic autonomy that allows a nation to decide the fate of its own resources. Sovereignty is hollow. If a country owns gold mines, but its people starve, if it has fertile land, but its citizens suffer famine, or if it exports raw materials cheaply while importing finished goods at inflated prices. For him, sovereignty means that African nations must break free from exploitative agreements that enrich foreign entities while leaving local communities impoverished. It means renegotiating or even rejecting contracts that give external actors the lion's share of profits from oil, uranium, gold, and other minerals that are abundant in Africa. Resource control goes beyond ownership. It extends to management, processing, and value addition within the continent. Historically, Africa has been locked in a pattern where its role is to supply raw materials while developed nations dominate manufacturing and technology. This imbalance is what sustains economic dependency. For instance, countries like Burkina Faso possess vast gold reserves. Yet their populations live in poverty because the gold is mined, exported, and refined elsewhere, with minimal benefit trickling back to the local economy. The same scenario applies to nations rich in oil, cobalt, and diamonds. This reality underlines the necessity of policies that prioritize in-country refining and processing industries, enabling African nations to capture greater value from their resources and create employment opportunities for their citizens. Another dimension of sovereignty that Traoré emphasizes is the capacity to resist external pressure. Many African governments find themselves at the mercy of powerful nations, global financial institutions, and aid organizations that dictate terms under the guise of development assistance. Loans and grants often come with conditions that compromise sovereignty, forcing governments to privatize key sectors, cut subsidies, or implement policies that favor foreign investors over local businesses. This form of economic blackmail erodes independence and perpetuates the cycle of poverty. For Africa to achieve real sovereignty, it must reduce reliance on foreign aid and instead harness its own resources strategically. This mental liberation is perhaps the greatest battle of all, because without it, even the best policies will falter under the weight of dependency thinking. Unity against neo-colonial influence is one of the most pressing imperatives for Africa today, because the fragmentation of the continent has always been a weapon in the hands of those who seek to dominate it. When Ibrahim Traoré speaks about unity, he is addressing not only political cooperation, but also a deep structural solidarity that can shield African nations from external control. The colonial era may have officially ended decades ago, but its logic persists in different forms: economic dependence, cultural dominance, and military influence. These are maintained through mechanisms that exploit divisions among African states. making it easier for powerful nations and multinational corporations to impose their interests. Neo-colonial influence thrives on disunity. African countries often negotiate individually with global powers and financial institutions, which allows stronger actors to dictate terms without fear of collective resistance. A single country can be pressured through sanctions, trade restrictions, or political interference, but a united bloc is far harder to manipulate. This is why unity is not just desirable, but necessary for Africa's liberation. Traoré's emphasis on solidarity recognizes that the continent's resources, markets, and human capital, if pooled together, form an immense source of strength that could redefine Africa's place in the global order. Historically, Africa has suffered because of the artificial borders drawn during colonialism, which carved the continent into over 50 states with varying languages, cultures, and political systems. These divisions have often been exacerbated by external actors who fuel rivalries, sponsor conflicts, and encourage dependency through bilateral agreements. The result is that African nations often compete against one another for the favor of foreign powers, rather than collaborating for mutual benefit. Neo-colonialism exploits these fractures by presenting aid and investment as lifelines, while attaching conditions that undermine sovereignty. For example, countries seeking loans from global financial institutions are often required to adopt policies that prioritize foreign interests over local development. Unity is the antidote to such manipulation. When African states come together to form common policies on trade, defense, and resource management, they reduce the leverage that external actors have over them. Regional organizations like ECOWAS and the African Union were established with this purpose in mind, but their effectiveness has often been hampered by lack of cohesion and external interference. Traoré's message calls for revitalizing these structures and making them instruments of genuine independence, rather than tools for foreign agendas. Unity must move beyond ceremonial summits and translate into concrete actions, such as coordinated economic strategies, shared defense mechanisms, and collective bargaining in international forums. Economic unity is particularly critical. Africa is rich in resources, yet its economies are largely dependent on exporting raw materials to developed nations and importing manufactured goods. This pattern keeps African countries vulnerable to fluctuations in global markets and reliant on foreign aid. By integrating their economies, African nations can create value chains within the continent, enabling them to process and trade goods internally rather than exporting raw materials at low prices and importing finished products at high costs. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is a step in this direction, but it will require political will, infrastructural development, and trust among nations to function effectively. Economic integration can create a continental market that strengthens Africa's negotiating power and reduces the influence of external actors who benefit from Africa's fragmentation. Unity is also essential in the realm of security. Neo-colonial influence often manifests through military interventions and security agreements that compromise sovereignty. Foreign powers justify their military presence in Africa under the pretext of combating terrorism or maintaining stability, yet their long-term presence often coincides with the protection of resource interests. Traoré has been vocal about rejecting foreign military bases and prioritizing African-led security initiatives. A united security framework where African nations collaborate on intelligence sharing, joint training, and rapid response would reduce dependency on foreign armies and empower the continent to address its own challenges without external interference. Cultural unity is another pillar of resistance against neo-colonialism. The dominance of foreign languages, media, and educational models often perpetuates a mindset of inferiority that aligns with external control. Unity in promoting African languages, history, and values can counter this cultural domination. It does not mean rejecting global knowledge or progress, but ensuring that African identity remains strong and that development models are rooted in African realities rather than imposed from outside. Cultural confidence is essential because neo-colonialism is not only an economic or political system. It is also a psychological condition that convinces people that their destiny lies in imitation rather than innovation. One of the greatest obstacles to unity is the presence of local elites who benefit from neo-colonial structures. These actors often serve as intermediaries for foreign interests, receiving personal benefits in exchange for policies that undermine national and continental sovereignty. Breaking this cycle requires accountability and leadership committed to the collective good rather than individual gain. Traoré's stance resonates because it challenges this pattern and advocates for leaders who prioritize African dignity over external approval. But leadership alone cannot achieve unity. It requires mobilizing the masses, educating citizens about the cost of division, and fostering a continental consciousness that sees Africa as one entity with a shared destiny. The global order is changing, and new power centers are emerging, but without unity, Africa risks being a pawn in the competition between global powers, rather than an equal player. Whether it is in negotiating trade deals, managing technology partnerships, or addressing climate change, a united Africa has the potential to influence global policies in ways that protect its interests. Disunity, on the other hand, ensures continued marginalization and exploitation, exploitation. Traoré's message is therefore a call to move beyond rhetoric and symbolism, and to embrace a practical, strategic, and enduring unity that empowers Africa to break free from the chains of neo-colonialism. Empowering the youth for continental liberation is not merely an idealistic slogan. It is a strategic necessity for the future of Africa. With over 60% of the continent's population under the age of 25, Africa is the youngest continent in the world. And this demographic reality presents both an opportunity and a challenge. The youth represent energy, innovation, and resilience, but without empowerment, they also risk becoming victims of unemployment, poverty, and disillusionment. Ibrahim Traoré has repeatedly emphasized that the liberation of Africa cannot be achieved without the active participation of its youth, because they are not only the leaders of tomorrow, but also the primary agents of change today. The concept of empowerment begins with education, not just in terms of literacy, but in cultivating a mindset of independence, creativity, and critical thinking. For decades, African education systems have been modeled on colonial structures that prioritize rote learning over problem solving and often glorify Western histories and values while neglecting African achievements and realities. This creates generations of young people who are academically trained but culturally disconnected and economically dependent. Traoré's vision calls for an education that equips the youth to control their resources, innovate in technology, and create indigenous solutions to local challenges. Such an education should integrate science, technology, engineering, and mathematics with African history, philosophy, and values so that young Africans grow with both technical competence and cultural confidence. Beyond education, economic empowerment is crucial. Many young Africans face unemployment or underemployment, despite having academic qualifications. This economic exclusion makes them vulnerable to exploitation and even recruitment by extremist groups. To reverse this, Africa must invest in industries that create jobs within the continent, particularly in sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, renewable energy, and digital technology. Traoré's message urges leaders to prioritize policies that encourage entrepreneurship among young people, provide access to credit for small businesses, and create an enabling environment for startups to thrive. When young people see viable economic opportunities at home, the brain drain that depletes Africa of its best minds can be significantly reduced. Another dimension of youth empowerment is political inclusion. Historically, African politics has been dominated by older elites, leaving the youth marginalized despite being the majority population. This disconnect often results in policies that fail to reflect the aspirations and realities of young people. Traoré himself symbolizes the power of youth in leadership, and his rise challenges the notion that age is a prerequisite for wisdom or effective governance. Empowering the youth means not only creating space for them in decision-making processes, but also dismantling systems that stifle political participation through corruption, nepotism, and excessive bureaucracy. The youth must be given platforms to influence governance, whether through elected positions, civic movements, or digital activism, because their voices are essential in shaping a future that serves their generation and those to come. Technological empowerment is equally significant in the liberation struggle. The world is increasingly driven by digital innovation, and Africa cannot afford to lag behind. Young Africans are already demonstrating creativity in fields like fintech, e-commerce, and software development, but they often lack access to infrastructure, capital, and global markets. Governments must therefore invest in broadband connectivity, digital literacy, and innovation hubs that nurture local talent. Traoré's emphasis on sovereignty extends to technology because reliance on foreign technology platforms without building indigenous capacity creates a new form of dependency. The youth must be at the forefront of technological development so that Africa can own its digital future rather than simply consuming technologies produced elsewhere. Cultural empowerment is another critical pillar. Neo-colonial influence often perpetuates cultural dependency, where young Africans measure success by Western standards and undervalue their own heritage. This mindset weakens the collective identity needed for continental liberation. Empowering the youth requires revitalizing African languages, arts, and traditions while integrating them with modern development. A strong cultural identity instills pride and resilience, making young people less susceptible to manipulation by foreign narratives. Traoré's speeches consistently highlight the importance of reclaiming African dignity, and this begins with the youth embracing their roots while shaping a modern, self-reliant Africa. The role of youth in peace and security cannot be overlooked. Conflicts across Africa often draw in young people, not as peace builders but as fighters, largely because of economic desperation and political marginalization. Empowering the youth means transforming them from instruments of instability into champions of peace. So, this requires inclusive governance, economic opportunities, and education that promotes tolerance and dialogue rather than division. Young people have the potential to be the strongest defenders of stability if they believe they have a stake in the continent's progress. Environmental consciousness is another dimension where youth empowerment intersects with Africa's future. Climate change poses a severe threat to the continent, affecting agriculture, water resources, and livelihoods. Young Africans must be educated and equipped to lead sustainable development initiatives, from renewable energy projects to reforestation and green technology. This not only addresses ecological challenges, but also creates new economic opportunities. Traoré's emphasis on sovereignty includes managing resources responsibly, and this responsibility will ultimately rest on the shoulders of today's youth. Finally, psychological empowerment is perhaps the most fundamental aspect of youth liberation. Centuries of colonialism and decades of neo-colonialism have fostered a sense of inferiority and dependency among many Africans. Breaking free from this mental bondage is essential for true empowerment. So young Africans must be taught to believe in their ability to innovate, govern, and compete globally without seeking constant validation from external powers. This confidence is the foundation upon which economic, political, and cultural empowerment will be built. Traoré's own leadership reflects this mindset, as he refuses to submit to external dictates and instead calls on Africans, especially the youth, to trust in their own strength and chart their own destiny.